sessions are resumed, and nobody's changed positions or rejoined us, so I'm not going to go through any housekeeping or introductions. We know each other from the early session. Whilst Inspector Fort's just preparing for further discussions, Mr. West, you wanted to say something?
I was discussing with my friends in Merton exactly your comments and what they meant. We have a slight difference. We seem to agree that there should be a lot of monitoring, proper monitoring, so we can assess the situation. And those sites that are troublesome should be identified. The question was, what would happen next? I was hoping that once these sites are identified, there would be some sort of process for trying to do something about it. I know you can't force people off land which they have planning permission on, although those sites are owned by the council, but some sort of maybe some development of some strategies that could help to resolve the problem. Whereas I think my friends here thought there wouldn't be much could be done about that.
I think what I was perhaps suggesting in the monitoring framework is that the plan can't go back and intervene in the planning permissions, but what the plan can do is check its implementation against its environmental performance. And if as a consequence of safeguarding sites, whatever, there might be, well, let's put it a different way. If there is environmental information that suggests that the direction of travel is in the wrong direction, and the plan is a contributory factor in that because of that wrong direction, and it's a scenario, it's not real, is because of air quality that's going to this particular site, then this particular site and its environs are giving rise to a problem. So therefore, we ought to review the plan or have some mechanism for review aspects of the plan to just have a look as to whether or not it's the plan and the way the plan's policies are that's giving a contributory factor to that aspect going the wrong way. What's in the power of the local planning authority at that point is to decide whether or not it wants to trigger a review of the plan. So for example, I'm not putting words into the mouth or suggesting this is what they do, but they could do, it's one way, is consider whether or not the continuation of safeguarding in a particular location against a scenario of plenty of capacity, and probably more now from what we talked about this morning from the DB rail issue, suggests that in resolving those environmental problems, there could be some corresponding mechanism in the plan that can review policies to see whether or not those policies are the best policies going forward in the future. Yes. So one aspect could be to say, well, actually, we have this safeguard and the air quality is, despite all our best intentions, it's going absolutely the wrong way. There will be other interventions and there will be other issues associated with that, but let's just have a check whether or not the plan is contributing to that going the wrong way, because if it is, then we're defeating the environmental objectives of the plan.
Yes.
So if we're defeating that, what do we do? Well, one thing you can do, well, let's have a look at it.
Yes.
And that's suggesting you don't have to do a formal review, but there is a mechanism for consideration of whether or not you do need to intervene. Now, we can't intervene with the planning permission because that's there.
Yes.
But what you can intervene with is the planning status of the site through its development plan, and whether or not in particular safeguarding should still apply in that scenario. Yes. So that's one mechanism, simplistic terms you could do, and that's, I think, what we probably were alluding to.
Yes.
So it's not intervening with the site, you can't do that. It's recognising whether or not the planning policies through this plan are still appropriate for that locality, given those change in those local circumstances, which is the environmental performance is going the wrong way.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what we're trying to allude to.
Yeah, I think, well, Evan's thinking he still understood it that way, and I'm thinking I understand it that way. I mean, it could lead to discussions with the contractor, which might encourage them to go somewhere else, for example. Exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a matter for the contractor.
Yes, exactly.
But equally, it's a matter for the local planning authority to consider whether or not environment. Well, we don't know. There's lots of interventions by the sounds of things going to happen that might change some of the dynamics and air quality in that locality, hopefully for the better, for obvious reasons. But if it doesn't, then there's one thing the plan can do is to check its environmental credibility, its credentials. And perhaps Inspector Fortnite is suggesting that maybe we've lost track a little bit of whether or not the plan's doing a sense check of its environmental credentials. It's checking lots of other things. It's checking everything to do with management of waste. But maybe it's not just checking its environmental credentials in line with what's happening with under monitoring, to be sure that this plan's not doing anything that's contrary to other objectives on those environmental credentials.
Yes.
So, for the risk of repeating myself, but if we do find there's something not right, then there's no reason why I can see that a sense check has taken place to see whether or not the plan's current policy regime is having a detrimental effect on those environmental credentials to the point where some review or some other intervention needs to happen to bring those back on track. So we're managing waste in an environmentally acceptable way, as opposed to a way that's causing other impacts that's not environmentally acceptable.
Yes.
And as I see it, there's no reason, it's not an hard process to do. It's just doing a check and balance, a sensible check and balance. And if something's not right, why isn't it right? And what do we need to do to put it right?
I'd very welcome that. Thank you.
Eben, do you want to say anything on that? Other than you're absolutely in agreement with all of that, sir.
I'll just highlight the opening statement of Mr. Normington that, it's in the local borough's prerogative to consider all these things, and safeguarding is one of the considerations. And if you take the safeguarding away, the site's still there, it's still operating with those extant planning conditions and obligations and things. So and then you have to consider whether the removal of safeguarding is going to address those issues you've identified. It might not. It may or it may not. There's so many issues there. But I'm sure Mr. West referred in the opening of his statement of our very good communication, and I'm sure that's going to continue soon.
When we talk about review, we weren't necessarily suggesting that would be the outcome. It is a possible outcome, but there are lots of other interventions as well. But I think the issue is, unless we check how we're doing those environmental credentials, we won't know. So one thing perhaps where the plan is slightly light is the fact that we're monitoring lots of things, but we just need that occasional sense check of whether or not some of the environmental impacts of the plan are right. And there will be other interventions that will feed into that, as you've mentioned, because there are other things the council's doing to think about air quality quite seriously. So it's just giving you the opportunity to have that sense check. What you do with that sense check, the outcome might be nothing, because we've got other interventions in other plans and strategies that will address that particular matter. But at least in terms of you as a group of boroughs, having confidence that the environmental impact of waste management is environmentally acceptable and it's in accordance with lots of other environmental strategies and policies within the development plan framework as a whole, then that's something maybe you would wish to reassure yourselves. If not, you will never know whether your plan is managing waste in an environmentally acceptable manner. So I see nothing wrong with that sense check. What comes out of that sense check is a matter that Inspector Fort and myself can't determine, because we don't know what it might say. But at least there's a format for some engagement and some discussion about, let's just see what we're doing. Is it going in the right direction? If it's not, what we're going to do about it. Nothing more than that. And it's not forcing you down an avenue. It's just forcing you down perhaps thinking about, let's just do an environmental sense check. Because genuinely, if I were to say to you, show me how I can look and tell if this plan is managing waste in an environmentally acceptable way. Where would I turn to in the monitoring framework that can reassure me that? And I probably can't, and that's the reason why kind of you think, well, probably this, it's not an hard monitoring indicator. It might not need to be annually, you might need to collect data over a period of time, but nonetheless, it's worth checking that everything, the checks and the balances on the way that plans managing waste is managed in an environmentally acceptable manner. nothing more than that. And that gives you the opportunity to have a little think about, well, if it's not, what do we do about it? And those can be then other intervention strategies that you might want to think about that might or might not push you down towards review of plan, partial review, no review whatsoever, but other interventions will deal with that. And obviously, because the monitoring framework, the annual monitoring report's a public document, the community can see that. So it seems to me that we've been open, transparent, environmentally responsible, environmentally reporting, and have got appropriate community engagement in all of that process. So unless you convince me otherwise, I can't see anything wrong with that.
Okay, is there anything else on air quality before we move on to other issues that are captured by matter 4? Okay, so in that case, we've just had a few more questions on this matter. So they're more in the character of the sort of general development control policies that are included in the plan, and particularly the issues to consider on particular sites and in regard to intensification. So we posed the question, it was 4I6, which was related to the National Planning Policy for Waste, particularly where it says that ensure that waste management facilities in themselves are well designed so that they contribute positively to the character and quality of the area in which they are located. So the modifications have been proposed that incorporate that phrase. But I'd like to turn your attention particularly to reference the modification reference 2.4. So this says it's part of the site, the issues to consider on the individual site. And that says contribute positively to the residential amenity of those properties in the vicinity of the site. So especially with regard to air emissions and noise impacts. So in those terms, thinking about the phrase contribute positively, how would a proposal show that or that it could contribute positively in those terms? And is it consistent with the National Planning Policy for Waste? Insofar as that bullet point, it's in paragraph 7, appears to be talking about design, sort of the character and appearance of the facility, rather than perhaps its residential amenity impacts. So you got any initial views on those points?
So if I can just clarify on the point, the policy says that you got to contribute positively to the character and the quality of the area. And the safe, and then the proposed modification for the safeguarded sites says, talks about the residential amenities and contribute positive to residential amenity. If I can just understand your question maybe a bit better, is it implied that it's actually addressing slightly two different things?
I mean, I take it the residential amenity is living conditions rather than, whereas the national planning policy for waste, when it talks about contributing positively, seems to be talking about design, character, appearance of a facility rather than those considerations. I just wonder whether you have any reflections on that. And then that's point one, I suppose. Point two is how would a proposal actually contribute? It's for intensification of a site. So there's an existing use there. How would the intensification contribute? Would it have to contribute positively, or would it have to have a neutral impact in those residential amenity terms?
On the first point, on the positive on the amount, I think that's a valid point, and I'm still thinking on it. And so thank you for that. I think we need to take that away and just think about it on design relative to amenity. I take your point there, and I just need to think on that. On whether proposals need to have a positive impact, I think that's what we are seeking to, should contribute positively to the character and quality of the area. And that will be your design assessment on form, materials, height, massing, views. Dare I say it, fairly typical design assessment with the help of design review panel and urban designers and assessment, and we'd have to come to that conclusion that it's positive. I think that's pretty clear. Whether if it's a neutral, that'll be, you know, on the balance of the judgment, but the policy starting off, the starting point is positive, so it needs to have a positive impact. That's my understanding of what we are requiring.
Can I push you a bit further on that? Amenity. If I said to you amenity, what immediately springs to mind? Thinking about a plan application, the word amenity. I'll give you an example. As a planning inspectorate, we don't use amenity. We'll use living conditions, but local planning authorities often use the word amenity, residential amenity, local amenity. What does it mean? And the difficulty I think we've got is understanding the interpretation and application of that policy, because I'm not so sure in what context amenity can be interpreted, because it could be easily interpreted that you mean in residential amenity. So in other words, this site's got a dust problem. It's going to intensify. You've got to resolve that dust problem. That's a positive benefit to amenity, but that's not what you mean. You mean probably an environmental, visual, all sorts of other positive contributions to amenity. So the difficulty we've got, I think, is the lack of clarity in that policy. And the lack of clarity is brought about by the term amenity, because amenity in different contexts can mean different things. And certainly we're not sure whether or not that could be incorrectly or correctly interpreted as meaning residential amenity, because often local planning authorities tend to use that, and hence their communities tend to associate with that as meaning living conditions, residential amenity. But what you're really meaning about is probably, by the sounds of it, environmental visual enhancement. So it's us saying, just have a little think about how you phrase that, because you could land yourself in trouble. Or equally, you could use that for the wrong reasons. If a development control officer in 10 years' time has still got this plan and you've all moved on to higher positions in other authorities or wherever you might be, and he says, well, I'll just have a look at that. He or she shares, that's amenity. Amenity is living conditions, positive contribution. Well, it can only be negative, this development, surely. I'm refusing it on amenity grounds. And then you get into all sorts of issues. And that kind of scenario does happen when people have moved on, and then you try to think, well, what was the meaning of this particular policy at that time? I don't know. Let's see if I can give a logical interpretation. That often comes to us then. But so just have a little think about the use of amenity and what you're really seeking to achieve by virtue of that policy.
Yeah, it's rather the amenity than the positive. The positive part is it's part of assessment. But I take your point on residential amenity.
You're seeking
and amenities,
enhancement. Yeah,
enjoyment.
there should be some environmental enhancement, and that can be visual, it can be ecological, it can be all sorts of things. But it's when you chuck in the word amenity, then it creates as and you could go even further as to what do you mean by positive. You know, is by virtue of the fact of, I don't know, a simple thing. I'm putting a PV cell on the roof. That's positive, but the building looks awful, but it's positive. So just have a think about what you really mean about that and how you could interpret it.
I think that's clear steer, so we'll have a think about that one.
Okay, we at regulation 19 stage, so the Environment Agency's response talked about an offer to assist with design guidance. So you've suggested modifications elsewhere which would delete references to the DEFRA 2008 guidance, which seems to be the most up-to-date national, although albeit it may be not extant now, and the superseded mayoral SPG on those issues. So I just wondered whether, because those kind of design documents aren't referred to in the plan anymore, whether there is a bit of a gap in the sort of more, particularly given the frameworks thrust and the recently revised framework, which places an emphasis. I'll just try and find the. It places an emphasis in section 12 on design guides and codes, which can be prepared at an area-wide, neighbourhood or site-specific scale, and so on. So it's a general question, really. Is there a gap in the plan, or is it something that's more relevant to the development, individual development plans of the boroughs? But in those cases, would boroughs have SPG that covered particularly sort of planning for waste uses, or would it be a more generalized type of design? So just some initial reactions to those comments, please.
The new emphasis in the MPPF is recognized that it's there on design. Earlier today, I referred to the reality of the relatively small quantum of waste schemes that come through within the South London waste plan area, and then quite many of them are relatively modest, and then from time to time, every 3-4 years, maybe you get something more significant. And although there's this, we recognize the MPPF's new emphasis, the borough's question had a discussion. Do you want to do an SPD for something that only comes around every now and again? And many modern waste facilities, as Mr. Furness from Suez pointed out, and as our policy seeks to have fully enclosed as a starting point, effectively fully enclosed, it's essentially an industrial building. It doesn't mean you can't have good quality and a positive impact, as we just discussed from a design point of view. So there is a gap, but I don't think it is something that's that the boroughs can't deal with. They have detailed design policies that will also be engaged, and we will consider them as any other significant, from a design perspective, significant industrial scheme comes forward, and it's not just a flippant welcoming engagement with the Environment AG. It's we would seek that, and I think there is a gap, as literally the last specified design, and I think particularly London-wide potentially. So there is a forum where all waste planning officers in London get together, and the Environment Agency meets there. So we can raise that there again to remind them, but nationally, that will be a great resource. But whether the 4 South London boroughs want to put in the resources for establishing an SPD for 4 schemes in every 2 years, maybe, it's a matter that we'll consider. But I don't think there's a great appetite. But we'll work with the Environment Agency if they want to do that. That's the honest reflection on it.
I agree with you. For once, I agree with you today. I'm only kidding. But maybe there's something in there because clearly any building design has to think about other policies and development plan. And I'm not suggesting this is a modification to policy, but it's just something where you want to just to put back into something what you've taken now is the fact that you expect any design that comes forward for a waste management facility to accord with the design requirements of other policies in the development plan. The development plan is across a plan area, so you don't have to be a specific council, you don't have to mention SPDs. It's a development plan across the plan area. So it's the plans of 4 boroughs and their associated SPDs and whatever they have on building design, because they will have something somewhere on the design of an industrial building. And that's essentially what this is, but for a waste use. So I think all we're suggesting is we've lost a little bit about how you're linking design, but you can simply put that link back in without too much effort. And we're not suggesting you do SPDs or anything like that, or whatever the future review of the planning system might introduce. But what you can do is just simply, and it's probably supporting text and nothing more. And it might even not be a major modification. It might be additional mod, just to explain how the environmental acceptability of a building would be considered. And it really is suggesting it's no different to industrial building. Industrial buildings are really matters of consideration for other development plans. You would expect this to align with that. And I don't really think that that's a major policy change. It's just an explanation as to how the implementation of that policy would be considered. It's probably an additional mod, to be honest.
So moving on from that to community consultation on proposals for waste development. So is it sufficiently clear as to how communities will be engaged on those sorts of proposals? And I recognise the references to the individual boroughs' statements of community involvement that have been made in the hearing statement, but I wonder whether those references to those SCIs needs to be in the plan, because obviously that the community engagement in waste planning is something that's mentioned in the national planning policy for waste. So obviously it's something that of importance in that respect. So have you got any views on that?
Firstly, well, simply yes, we agree that it would be helpful to recognise SCI. So I think we'll consider having some text in the plan to explain that for planning applications, the SCIs establish how the local communities will be consulted as part of those applications.
Thank you, Mr. Bright. Are there any views, Mr. West, on any of that we discussed so far?
No views.
So moving on to the question we asked about the agent of change principle, but we asked, we framed a question. It was matter 4.5 about the distinction between the terms existing waste site, an extant scheme, and permission for additional capacity. So if I could ask Mr. James, could you explain how your proposed modification would help to achieve clarity on those matters?
Would you have the reference in front of you? So I'm just flicking through the very long, overly long statement we wrote, trying to.
I think it's in the glossary, Mr. James, but I'm struggling to find the.
Thank you. I'll get there in a second. Sorry. Can't find it, but anyway, obviously we put forward some modifications to try and clarify what we mean by each of those terms to address the question that was originally asked in the written statements. I'm potentially detecting that we haven't offered enough clarity within the modification that we've put forward, sir. Perhaps we need to.
I'm just wondering whether that's the way to achieve it. It's a shame Mr. Furness has gone, because he had a further suggestion in his hearing statement. I would have liked to have heard him discuss further. But I've got the actual reference for it. It's in the additional modifications. It's reference 31. So I think as it stands, you're suggesting keeping those terms within the policy, but then having the glossary definitions. I just welcome your views on, is that clear? Does the supporting text appropriately reference where those definitions can be picked up? So it's not a major criticism. Again, it's just a sense check as to whether that's abundantly clear to someone picking up the plan for the first time.
I'm catching back up now, so apologies. I have got it in front of me now, and I recall the statement that had some alternative wording proposed for these definitions. I mean, we'd be happy to revisit that and see if the alternative wording that was put forward by the participant offers better clarity than we have. I think you're right, it's not a major point, but obviously it's something that's worth being clear on. So we can have a look at that, and we can put forward a further modification if we feel that we can improve the clarity on that point.
Just to assist you there, so it's Mr. Furness's, it's the Suez hearing statement, and it's page 2 of that. So he talks about how WP8, policy WP8 could be amended to offer clarity. So if you could consider that alongside your suggestions and come to a view on which it provides the greatest clarity there.
Yes, we'll do so. I think it's coming back to me now. I think this is probably a sensible suggestion that has been put forward, but we can obviously give some thought to that and then confirm that when we're drafting the modifications.
Thank you. Okay, one more question on this matter from us, Mr. James. So it's in relation to the M12 site, if I could take you to that. And it's whether the amenity criterion that relating to the users of Wandle Park should be added to that site as well. That was something that's been raised in the Wandle Forum's hearing statement. So that's point one on that. And then point two is, do you have any other reactions to the matters raised in the Wandle Valley Forum in its hearing statement with respect of safeguarding of routes, provision of open space and so on, in respect of those sites that are adjacent to there?
I might defer that to my colleagues in Merton, who are obviously closer to these sites, and address those questions, if that's okay, Eben.
Thank you. In relation to M12 NJB recycling at Weir Road, there is already a statement in the plan about the amenity of the users of the future Wandle Valley Regional Park. It's worth noting that the Wandle Trail runs quite close to the site beside the River Wandle on the existing green space adjacent to the site. Regarding the other comments provided by the Wandle Valley Forum, yes, we acknowledge those. In many cases, there are already existing trails in the area, and there are currently no plans by the local authority or anyone else to extend trails. The Wandle Trail already runs down past the Weir Road sites and past the Willow Lane sites. And without clear plans in place or the finances to deliver extra expansions, we don't propose at this time to take those forward in this plan.
And should it be a requirement of any proposal for intensification of those sites to contribute to something like that, in your view, Ms. Butler?
I think at this point in time, unless they're introducing more people to the use of the existing Wandle Trail, we wouldn't suggest that that we create a policy provision to require those sites to contribute to the existing trail or to provide extra trails. Again, a new trail would have to be delivered as a whole rather than a piecemeal approach, and it would also have to be maintained. And currently there are no plans for that.
As I understand it, I agree with what you're probably saying, but in terms of addressing the concerns, in terms of thinking about a response, then any new plan application clearly is going to require a travel plan. It's going to require a design and access statement. Clearly, there might be an intensification of use along those routes as a consequence of a new proposal or intensification. It will be caught at that mechanism, wouldn't it? We're caught at that stage through the design and access statement or the travel plan, which would identify as an intensification, does intensification require contribution? In other words, there is an existing mechanism that can deal with that concern. without putting something in the plan. Is my thinking right?
Yes, that's correct. On a case-by-case basis, we could consider section 106 or section 278 provisions to do just that.
And again, I think that that's covered in the list of documents that be required in support of a planning application anyway. So in my view, no further modification would be necessary.
If we can just clarify that, it's particularly that I think the most pertinent site is actually M6, which is the Killochry site on Willow Lane. And so there is a 8-meter wide buffer strip on, which is effectively, it's an environment agency requirement for access and maintenance to river edges. So that has been inserted as part of a modification. In the representation from the Wandle Valley, it goes further and beyond. So what Ms. Butler was referring to was the Wandle Trail is a good quality trail. It's on the south bank of the river. The industrial sites are on the north bank, and what the Wandle Valley Forum is in particular is requiring is that there is an additional improved access on the north bank, whereas the borough is saying there's already a good quality trail on the south bank. There is the 8-meter buffer strip is being specified on the north bank, but going beyond that and saying there should be another trail on the north bank also is the point that we're saying there's no plans at the moment for that.
And I don't think myself and Inspector Fort are arguing against that. I think what we're really saying is that there is a mechanism already in the system that will consider whether or not the access to sites is adequate. And that's through the design and access statement, that is through travel plans, etc. It may or may not be the case that identifies that additional improvements are necessary on a case-by-case basis. But given that scenario whereby that mechanism is already in place, does this plan need to address it? Inspector Fort's comment was quite right. Probably not, because the mechanism in place. So I know we're trying to push it into different areas throughout the day in terms of thinking about modifications. This is surprisingly one where we're not. But the justification for that, it's not being flippant. It's recognising the comment they've made, but equally recognising that actually in the consideration of any new plan application, that matter would have to be considered, access to the site through the design and access statement and possibly travel plans. And if there was indeed an impact arising from that development that would necessitate improvement or additional provision, then that's a mechanism that would catch it. So what I'm really saying is you're already covered in the sense of there is a mechanism of taking on the concerns. The concerns would need to be considered, but that mechanism doesn't require necessarily policy in the plan. It's part and parcel of the development control. That's me showing my age. The development management regime of all councils. So you would require travel plans. You would require design and access statements. You would look at pedestrian routes into and out of sites. You would look at the adequacy of those pedestrian routes. You would identify whether or not improvements required. It's already caught. So I can, there's only so far the plan can go without reasonable justification. And it can't really be seen to be implementing other things that are not associated with development that's applicable in this plan. But there is another mechanism that can look at it, and that mechanism is already there.
Okay, so that concludes our questions on matter 4. So just before we wrap up this session, is there anything further, Mr. West or Mr. Simpson, that you want to add at this juncture?
Not really. I just, since you're asking me, I just had one comment. I think the Wandle Trail is a very important trail. And if there are developments that affect this trail, then they should be taken into account of in our previous discussion of how the sites are. The sites in Weir Road are right up against the trail. And this isn't helping the trail, which is very much used now, particularly during pandemic. There were people going all the time. Thank you.
Is there any particular response on how the plan has taken that into account? Because it is referred to, isn't it, in terms of the Merton sites?
I can feel all these eyes turning round. Yes. Yes, it is referred. I'm just trying to find a reference. And my colleague points out it's in some of the Croydon sites as well, the Wandle running from Croydon to Wandsworth through Merton and Sutton.
I'll just draw your attention to its additional mod 15.2, which says protecting the amenity of those using the Wandle Valley Regional Park has been added to all the pertinent sites. So the Wandle Trail runs all along as far as it can along the River Wandle, and it's pretty much always within the Wandle Valley Regional Park. The sites are, they're not inhibiting the trail, none of the sites, they are adjacent to. And so, you know, you could seek enhancements on the boundary works as typical matters to address, which in fact we have done, particularly on the Weir Road, try to seek appropriate boundary works between the Wandle Trail, which is metropolitan open land. It's a sink. It's, you name the designation, it's probably on top of it. So there is there's ample opportunities to consider and enhance it. But the proposals don't hinder the trail. There's no blockages to that.
Thank you. That's just triggered another question, actually, in terms of, so I'm looking at the additional modifications now. But this is, and perhaps jumping the gun on what we might discuss in the closing session. But so where you've put forward protecting the amenity of those using the Wandle Valley Regional Park as a criterion in those relevant sites. Is that more in the character of a main modification rather than an additional one? I wonder why it's ended up in the additional modifications table. It's something we can resolve in post-hearings correspondence, but as main modifications are those that materially affect policies or their interpretation. I wonder whether that falls more readily into that category.
I think you're probably right, sir. I think it was put there because that appeared in some of the sites, but not all of them. It was included then to have consistency across all those sites that were adjacent to the Wandle Valley Regional Park. So that's probably why it slipped into the additional mods. But actually, it is an issue for each of those sites to deal with individually. So I think you're probably right that it should appear in the main mod schedule actually as we move forward.
Just, well, I wouldn't have said that if you had to volunteer to do something. But just on that, you could look up belt and braces on that one as well. But it's not just the users. it's the integrity of the trail itself as well that affects the users too, because obviously you could have drainage discharge, you could have all sorts of deleterious material that blows over or gets deposited on the trail. So it is about amenity of the user of the trail, but it's also ensuring that the integrity of the trail is not prejudiced by development proposals. So it's a little bit of a two-way street, really. So if I wouldn't have gone that far if you weren't doing something with it, but seeing as you're doing something with it, you could go a little bit further by just thinking about the physical aspect of the trail itself and ensuring development doesn't have a detrimental effect on that. And the examples are, it could be drainage, it could be litter blowing over the top, it could be dust boulders, anything that falls onto the trail itself that might damage its integrity. So it's just ensuring that development does recognise that, yes, the users are one thing, but the users need to walk on an acceptable surface that's not prejudiced by the development that's next door to it.
Mr. West.
Sorry to add another comment. I'd just like to support that last point. When you're walking along the trail, it is a very beautiful trail for a lot of the way. But when you walk past the waste sites, you're very aware of it. For example, the dust. So if anything can be done, that would be good.
Okay, thank you. So that, as I said, that concludes our discussion of matter 4. So thank you all for your contributions this afternoon. We're now going to take a short adjournment till say 4:05, just after 5:05, and then we'll come back and we'll do the closing session. Okay, so the hearing's now adjourned.